On December 21st, 2012, the ancient Maya long count calendar cycled, possibly back to its zero-day origin. There had never been as much attention paid to the Maya, and there hasn't been since. Yet they are one of the most successful societies in all of human history. They have survived for more than 3,000 years. At the peak of their civilization, they dominated most of Mesoamerica for 700 years and made scientific advancements that rival any human civilization before or since. We don't know exactly how Mesoamerica was first populated, but we know that the Maya were not the first people to arrive there. The region had human inhabitants at least 12,000 years ago. In pre-Columbian times, around 50 million people lived there, speaking dozens of languages. Mesoamerica is only one of a handful of areas in the world that deserve to be called a cradle of civilization. The Macaya were the region's earliest known sedentary people, around 4,000 years ago. They settled in Soconusco on the south coast, now the Mexican state of Chiapas. But the Olmec people were the first to form a recognizable, advanced civilization with agriculture, art, politics, science, and toward their demise, basic literacy. They established themselves around 1,500 years before the Common Era in the area known as San Lorenzo Tenochtitlan on Mexico's Gulf Coast. At this time, much of Mesoamerica was still populated by small, migrant, hunter-gatherer clans. Sedentary societies would not become the norm for another few hundred years. So the Olmec were able to expand their empire through much of modern-day Mexico. They began to decline around 500 years before the Common Era and eventually disappeared 300 years later. Also around 500 years before the Common Era, and about 200 kilometers southeast of Mexico City, in what is today's Mexican state of Oaxaca, the Zapotec people began to flourish and establish their own civilization. It was originally formed from 3 neighboring societies who had previously been enemies. They were the most powerful group in the area, and within a few hundred years had greatly expanded their area of dominance. Their most famous historical site is Monte Alban, which has a building dubbed the Conquest Slab. It appears to record the history of the spread of Zapotec power in one of the earliest writing systems ever found in Mesoamerica. There is written evidence that not all their expansion was met with resistance. Therefore, the Zapotec may be the first in a long history of colonizers of Mesoamerica. Although they were ultimately conquered by the Spanish in the early 16th century, the Zapotec's descendants survive to this day. They are still the largest indigenous group in Oaxaca, and modern dialects of their language are spoken as far away as Los Angeles in the United States. Emerging some 1,500 years after the Zapotec and residing just west of them were the lesser-known Mixtec people. In fact, the Mixtec seized control of Monte Alban from the Zapotec. Their ancient writings have survived in greater number than those of any Mesoamerican peoples. Their descendants live on in parts of Mexico and the United States. The Toltec people dominated Tula in what is now the Mexican state of Hidalgo from 800 to 1000 of the Common Era. That is, if they existed at all. Scholars still debate whether the Toltec were ethnically and culturally different from the Aztec. The Aztec themselves dominated southern and central Mexico from the early 13th century until the Spanish conquest. At the heart of their empire was Tenochtitlan, known today as Mexico City. At various times in their history, they had cultural ties and probably trading relationships with other Mesoamerican peoples, such as the Zapotec and Mixtec, occasionally waging war with them as well. It is within this broad geographic, historic, and ethnographic context that we must place the ancient Maya. They are best understood by examining their geography and their history, which can be divided into three broad timelines. The pre-classic period lasted for about 2,000 years, beginning around 1800 before the Common Era. At the beginning, they were relatively small and isolated wandering groups. They slowly mastered agriculture and established settlements that grew in size and spanned multiple generations. Somewhere along this timeline, much larger settlements emerged. They may have been helped by speaking a common language initially, Proto-Mayan. They eventually established societies so large that they became city-states. These included the beginnings of the great sites at Copan, Palenque, and Tikal, as well as lesser-known ones such as El Mirador and Huachatún. In a relatively short time, tremendous progress was made in the fields of mathematics, astronomy, architecture, engineering, and writing. This progression could not have happened without the emergence of political leaders to orchestrate the massive effort involved. Building on these achievements, the Maya rose to the cultural peak of their civilization, which lasted about another 700 years, the Classic period. Art and science flourished during this timeline, but they may have become too successful for their own good. Already an extinct language, Proto-Mayan had diversified to become the Mayan languages that are still spoken today. While they were able to support very large city-states, up to hundreds of thousands of people in some cases, this very achievement also made the Maya vulnerable. They had become insular competing societies. Along with their achievements came perhaps complacency and a sense of invincibility. This led to war among the city-states throughout the Classic period. In the 10th century, something changed. The details, which we will examine later, are still debated. But we know that the Maya Empire began to decline. This was the post-Classic period, from around the middle of the 10th century until the arrival of the Spanish, almost 600 years later. The Maya lived in three broad areas. The northern lowlands covered much of the Yucatan Peninsula, while the southern lowlands covered the El Petén region of northern Guatemala, bordering parts of Mexico, Belize, western Honduras, and western El Salvador. The southern highlands covered most of southern Guatemala and southeastern Mexico. Due to the distances between them, as well as the topography of these regions, some Maya groups would have had more mutual contact than others. But we can see that far from being a unified, united people, the Maya should be viewed as multiple peoples, inhabiting multiple regions, in conditions of both cooperation and conflict. This reality makes it all the more remarkable that they were so successful and left behind such a rich and impressive legacy. Although they are often credited with all three achievements, the Maya did not create the Mesoamerican calendar systems, invent writing, or pioneer pyramid building techniques. Instead, like most innovators, they built on knowledge that already existed from the work of their predecessors. They refined that knowledge into a cohesive understanding of the world more than any other Mesoamerican people. Their observations encompassed everything around them, from mountains and lakes to trees and the life forms that lived in them. They saw connections in these observations and sought to explain them. They studied nature in balance and harmony, as well as witnessing its powerful destructive force. They could not have failed to see the patterns that emerge from such observations. Maya scholars were perhaps the first to seek the elusive, scientific theory of everything. They were keen observers of the sky, which they studied from observatories such as this one at Chichen Itza and this one at Palenque. These observations allowed them to develop mathematical models of the planets, the stars, and cosmological events. This in turn led to the refinement of existing calendar systems, and with it, predictive ability. Probably the best example of that ability can be found at Chichen Itza. The main pyramid there, El Castillo, is itself a solar calendar. One of the facades is guarded by two serpent heads. On the spring and fall equinoxes, a spectacular event takes place. Due to the design of the pyramid, as the Earth rotates, a 5-hour light and shadow effect creates the illusion that one of the serpents is slowly coming to life, as the sunrise creates a series of triangles from top to bottom, reaching the head at its culmination. Archaeologists are not sure why the Maya built the pyramid this way, but it is certainly no accident. Many of the buildings at Chichen Itza feature serpent heads depicting their feathered serpent god, Kukulkan, suggesting the likelihood that the whole site was actually a center of ceremony and ritual. This is just one example of how the Maya incorporated all aspects of their knowledge into a holistic worldview. As we see throughout history, knowledge begets knowledge when new data are incorporated into refined understanding. The mathematical techniques used to model the cosmos would have also been employed by the architects and engineers of the classic Maya buildings, whether they were built in Tikal, Copan, or Coatepec. It is less clear how the Maya related their scientific knowledge to their religious beliefs. They entertained elaborate views about the supernatural world, without what we now consider scientific evidence. There was likely a positive bias effect at work, since some aspects of nature must have appeared to them to have inexplicable order and planning. So the serpent effect at Chichen Itza was probably designed to conform to their preconceptions rather than to test them. At the height of their empire, Maya cities were among the most populated in the world. Just to feed everyone required great planning and engineering. The Maya rose to the challenge. As demonstrated at Palenque and other sites, they practiced irrigation and freshwater storage. This is also hinted at in a reenactment of one of their ancient rituals. So it may be that phenomena like tracking the equinoxes at Chichen Itza played a role in planning agriculture also. As all this knowledge was discovered and integrated into their worldview, the Maya understood the benefit of recording and communicating it. This was the driving force behind their refinement of writing, in which they would eventually develop one of the most complex writing systems ever devised. The first symbols of Maya writing to be understood by modern scholars were numerals. It is because of this that we are able to understand the Maya calendars. The Maya used many calendars for different reasons. One of the oldest is the Tzolk'in, or sacred calendar. It marks the passing of 260-day cycles, which is also the length of both human pregnancy and the growing period of maize. Like our own calendar, the Tzolk'in comprises named days. The first 7 are shown here in their original language and their English translation. But unlike our calendar, a Maya month has 20 named days. There is no equivalent of a week. To appreciate why, we must first understand Maya numerals and counting. We can borrow from our knowledge of Arabic numerals and Greek number placement. We learn at a young age how a unit moves left into a tens column by adding a 0, and a hundreds column by adding a further 0. The Maya invented the same counting system of zeros and number placement. Imagine if instead of a column moving left, the unit was a row that moved up. This is the first principle of counting in Maya. The second principle requires the concept of 5s rather than 10s as the next counting group. The first 4 units in the 5 each receive a dot. Possibly stones or pebbles were used when counting was first devised, and are replaced by a bar, possibly a twig or a stick originally, to represent a group of 5 units. Above this bar are placed 4 more dots to count 6, 7, 8 and 9, until 2 bars represent 10. The same idea extends to 19 before the Maya used the concept of 0, possibly a shell originally. When going from 9 to 10 in our system, the 9 is replaced by a 0 and a 1 appears to the left. When going from 19 to 20 in the Maya system, the 19 is replaced by a 0 and a 1 appears above it. So this is not the representation of 10 rotated 90 degrees clockwise, but 20, a counting term that we still use sometimes also, a score. Similarly, 2 dots above a 0 represent 40, and 1 dot above 2 zeros represents 400 instead of 100. Base 10, or decimal counting, is replaced by the more efficient base 20. The 20-day Maya month cycles 13 times to form the Tzolk'in calendar. It is still used today in many Maya communities. The Maya knew that the Earth orbits the Sun once every solar year. They approximated this with a second calendar in which the same 20-day cycle repeats 18 times instead of 13. That calendar marks 360 days, falling short of a true solar year by 5 days. So it is sometimes called the vague calendar. They added 5 days, considered unlucky days, at the end of the cycle to represent a true solar year. The Maya will always be known best for their long count calendar. That is the calendar that cycled back to its beginning on December 21st, 2012, amid so much hype. It also uses mainly base 20 counting. The first cycles are the same 20 days counted 18 times found in the vague calendar. 20 repetitions of the vague calendar form a tune, and 20 tunes form a katun, while 20 katuns make up a baktun. For reasons that may never be known, 13 baktuns bring the entire calendar back to the year zero. Having realized that dots, bars and shells were not decorations, but written dates in Maya history, scholars took another look at the inscriptions. The pictorial scenes often looked like cartoon characters. In some cases, they were pictorial records of important events. Here, we see a depiction of a ball player. But soon the scholars realized that other cartoon characters might have been drawn to record more than a simple pictorial representation. The breakthrough came when they deciphered the inscriptions on these stelae to be the written record of Maya dynasties. Spurred on by that finding, later, more detailed study identified patterns among the pictures. Incredibly, a lot of those patterns would then be analyzed and eventually understood for the first time in 1,000 years by a boy of only 12. He uncovered what we now know, that Maya scribes used different ways of writing the same concept. Out of his observations, we have finally been able to read and understand the script and reimagine the society that created it. It is only through this understanding that we can now see what the ancient Maya left behind, their true legacy. We carry that legacy today. In English, the word cigar comes from the Mayan sikar, meaning to smoke, while the word shark comes from the Mayan shock. We may also be carrying the legacy of their eventual demise. If you live in a civilization whose survival might be threatened by overexploitation of natural resources, the unequal distribution of wealth and power, or changes to the climate, your own legacy may end up having something in common with that of the ancient Maya. When modern explorers and archaeologists first began investigating their ancient world, it was widely assumed that the Maya had been wiped out. But now we know that they have survived to the present day, albeit in much smaller numbers. We can define 4 stages of their decline and their ultimate conquest. In the late Classic period, the Maya Empire was at its height. Then, very suddenly and very rapidly, most of the great cities were abandoned and left to fall into ruin. Soon, they were mere relics that would not be rediscovered for another millennium. It is impossible that the Maya would have risked their future survival in this way for no reason. So why did they do it? Modern Mayanists have theorized that there was some kind of huge environmental catastrophe, or perhaps there was a popular uprising led by the peasants who made up the majority of the population. Others suggest there may have been epidemic disease or overexploitation of natural resources, leading to famine. Still others suggest that economies became unsustainable due to excessive warmongering or the collapse of trade among the established competing Maya city-states, and that this left them vulnerable to attack and usurping by other Mesoamerican peoples. Recently discovered geoclimatic evidence confirms that some of the Maya regions of Mesoamerica experienced sudden large climate change in the late Classic period, resulting in the worst local droughts for 7,000 years. This would have inevitably placed great strain on essential resources such as food and water, and it is very likely that people started migrating in large numbers to the great cities. The same resources, in turn, would have become scarcer in those cities, leading to famine and eventually disease. We know that Maya societies at this time were socially and economically very stratified. The elite minority held political, religious, and economic dominion over the masses. In the face of declining food and water, it is certainly plausible that popular revolt could have followed. We also know that Maya rulers controlled their citizens, at least in part, by their ability to use science to make predictions. Because they wouldn't have been able to predict the drought, the rulers might have suffered loss of confidence from the masses, and that would have fueled dissent and revolution. The archaeological record also confirms that the Maya were a warmongering people at the height of their empire. Most Mayanists now believe that some combination of these factors caused the beginning of the decline of the Maya Empire. Whatever the exact reasons were, the collapse of the large cities drove the surviving Maya into smaller settlements, and the surge in population of the Classic period had ended, marking the beginning of the second stage of decline, the post-Classic period. It was once believed that the introduction of viruses from Europe by the conquistadors caused the Maya to become extinct. Certainly European viruses contributed to the further decline in numbers of the Maya, just as they did with other indigenous populations of the Americas. But as we have just seen, the first stage of decline was complete, and the second stage had already started when the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century. The Spanish found the great cities in ruin and paid little attention to the Maya in their initial exploration of the region. But this doesn't mean that the Spanish had no impact on the further decline of the Maya. In the early part of the 16th century, the smallpox virus they brought with them played a particularly dramatic role in reducing the Maya population even further. The third stage of decline, but one also marked by conquest. By 1524, the Kaqchikel and the Quiche peoples had succumbed to Spanish dominance and rule in the lower highlands of Guatemala. The former Kaqchikel capital at Iximché had been replaced by the first Spanish capital of that country. Having recently overpowered the Aztec Empire to the west, the conquistadors now marched north toward Yucatan and east toward Belize, El Salvador, and Honduras, taking an army of considerable native allies along with them. Conquest would be slow and bloody during the next 100 years, as the peoples of Belize, northern Guatemala, and Yucatan in particular endured prolonged resistance. It was during this time that the Spanish also carried out a campaign of ethnocide. They regarded the Maya as pagans, even mistaking their elaborate writing system for a form of devil worship. Almost every form of Maya art and literature that could be destroyed was destroyed in their attempts to convert the Maya to Catholicism. The conquest was all but halted for another 70 years, until the Itzá were the last unconquered Maya people. The Itzá had retreated to the island of Tayasal, now called Flores, near Lake Petén in northern Guatemala, where they still live to this day. The city there fell to the Spanish on March the 13th, 1697. The first stage of Maya decline lasted around 200 years. Almost 200 years after their first contact with Europeans, the Maya had now been conquered. The history of Mesoamerica over the next 100 years is mainly one of Spanish colonial rule. The pure-blood indigenous inhabitants had by now been relegated to the lowest status in a class-based hierarchical society. For the most part, they no longer owned their land, and they made a living as laborers for the new colonial landowners. By 1821, a rebellion by the colonists had gained political independence from Spain from Mexico. This sparked another 50 years of regional war, turmoil, further European colonization and independence movements, leading essentially to the political map of Mesoamerica that we know today. The situation for the Maya worsened as they were effectively sidelined amid these sweeping changes. But the unrest had not ended. There was a brief revolution in Mexico at the turn of the 20th century, led by people such as Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata. At the same time, the United States began a strategic masterminding of Central American politics, which continues to this day, to protect its business interests there. A landmark historical event of the time was the opening of the Panama Canal. Ironically, it is still the major transportation link between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans that enables trade between Europe and Asia. It was Columbus's original quest to find such a trade route on his first voyage, but the Pacific Ocean was only revealed to him on his final voyage by the indigenous people of the area. The first half of the 20th century was marked by proxy wars and political dictatorships in the region, as well as the rise of various guerrilla movements. The most notable for its impact on the Maya is the Guatemalan Civil War, which over its 35 years led to the killing of tens of thousands of Maya. The Maya continued to be subjugated, marginalized and exploited, and this continues today. Just in the last few years, there have been cases of the destruction and looting of ancient Maya sites for selling artifacts on the illegal market. Columbus may not have been the first European to find the Americas by sailing west, but he certainly had no prior knowledge of the continents which had had thriving human populations for thousands of years. Had those landmasses drifted just a few hundred kilometers further west, Columbus and his crew might have died before reaching them in 1492, and Europeans might not have attempted the same journey before the Maya themselves might have sailed east. Throughout history, all the great civilizations left descendants and legacies to attest to their story. Modern Greek still uses largely the same language and script of Socrates. Perhaps more importantly, many of his ideas still influence our world thousands of years later. And so it is with the Maya. Dozens of Mayan languages are still spoken, often as a first language. Ancient Maya buildings still stand, and many are being rediscovered hundreds of years after they were built. But perhaps more than any of the great civilizations, the ancient Maya have passed on to their descendants a legacy that remains remarkably intact. Some of their calendars are still in use, even though they predate our Gregorian calendar by centuries. In this remote Tzotzil village in Mexico, the clothes of the saints are washed every 20 days of the Tzolkin calendar. They are then dried in the sun, after which the saints are redressed and ceremonially paraded through the village. Maya descendants continue to practice other aspects of their religion. Although most practices have over the centuries been fused with Catholicism, distinctions remain. Easily mistaken for the Christian cross, this Maya cross casts its late afternoon shadow on the facade of a colonial church. The Spanish may have replaced observatories with spires, and even Mormonism has taken hold in this Belizean Mopan community. But this mother teaches her daughter about the old times, when maize was more than food, it was sacred. Although human sacrifice is no longer practiced, some Maya still perform rituals that are over 1,000 years old. Teenagers happily dance in their ancestors' footsteps during school recess, while those who no longer go to school sell clothes that their parents still make using traditional methods. And not just for sale, but to clothe their own children as well. Pocomchi men can sometimes be seen playing the role of modern caballeros, and the Tzeltal still fire their pottery using pre-Columbian techniques. Today's visitor to Mesoamerica is surrounded by a Maya culture that is both modern and ancient. More and more that ancient culture is being revived and celebrated. For the first time in a millennium, the ancient script is now being taught again, and Mayan languages on the verge of extinction are being passed on to the next generation. Ancient wisdom is being revisited in the hope of teaching the way forward, and traditional Maya music has found new expression.
Pueblo bello y querido, mi corazón herido, cuando le compré fui, nostálgico volví. cantar los millones al amanecer. Juan Sonado, camino a su propiedad. Bailando un son que alegra mi corazón, como dando ya la bendición de acá. Tierra de mi amor, textura de color, donde el ombligo quedó y el tiempo lo escondió. Pueblo bello y querido, mi corazón herido, cuando lejos me fui, nostálgico volví. Gracias.
100 years ago, a revolution was taking place in Mexico. 30-year-old Emiliano Zapata, a descendant of the Aztec people, founded a peasant movement that became known as Zapatismo. Although he was assassinated at age 39, the reforms he advocated to restore land ownership to indigenous people had been written into the national constitution and would eventually be put into effect, albeit not on the scale he envisioned. 75 years after his death, the world was shocked on January the 1st, 1994, when the fledgling Zapatista Army of National Liberation, following his cause and his ideologies, began occupying parts of Chiapas state in Mexico. The timing was no coincidence. The North American Free Trade Agreement had come into effect that morning. 2 years earlier, and to pave the way for the agreement, the Mexican government had acquiesced to the United States and overturned the land ownership legislation that Zapata had fought for. Zapata remains a hero to many of Mexico's indigenous people. And perhaps for that reason, the modern Zapatismo movement has received empathy and support from many of its indigenous inhabitants, as well as from solidarity movements around the world. So threatened was the Mexican government that it immediately increased its military presence in Chiapas. At one point, a third of its entire army occupied the state. That presence remains today, and the military has been accused of employing ethnic cleansing strategies in the region. The ideological cause of modern Zapatismo has much in common with its original movement. While it takes inspiration from Zapata himself, pictured here on the left, it also draws on the ideas of Che Guevara and those of its former spokesman, now named Subcomandante Insurgente Galeano. One of their main slogans is Para todos todo, nada para nosotros. Their mission is manifold. Education of children in both Spanish and Mayan languages. Healthcare, including the practice of both traditional Maya and Western approaches. Agricultural autonomy, gender equality, and cooperative economic development, such as international fair trade of coffee and textiles. It is the redefinition of democracy, unknown to Socrates, advocated and promoted through the use of modern technology. The ease of international travel, our fascination with ancient history, and the welcoming climate of Mesoamerica have all converged to increase the attention directed at the Maya. This culminated in the long count calendar cycling to the 13th Baktun in December of 2012. Not surprisingly, the governments of Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico cashed in on the opportunity to promote tourism, just as the media and Hollywood cashed in on the doomsday myth. Maya people themselves had little control over these events. This boom in public interest continues in the tourism sector today. The best-known Maya archaeological sites are among the most visited destinations in the whole region. and facilities are continually being expanded to accommodate visitors. Nowhere is this more pronounced than in the northeastern Yucatan Peninsula. The Riviera Maya, as it has come to be known, is the ever-growing portion of the Caribbean coastline that stretches for countless kilometers and is these days synonymous with excess. Further inland, the less visited Maya communities remain almost untouched by this new wave of colonization. Across the border in Guatemala, the visitor to Tikal can shop at a Maya shopping mall, but little there is of indigenous origin. This is also the case across the Belize border at one of that country's main archaeological sites, Zunantunech. The modern would-be colonist has to venture into much smaller and off-the-beaten-track places to trade with modern Maya artisans. Maya peoples are more isolated from each other today than they have ever been. Yet a sense of collective identity has emerged that is stronger than it has ever been. While daily life is harsh, even a struggle in many Maya communities, there is a sense that communal bonds and the heritage of 100 generations will ensure their future survival. In many ways, they resist and even shun outside influences as much as they did when those influences first arrived hundreds of years ago. But, like most people in the 21st century, the Maya are slowly embracing the modern world. Sometimes the adaptation takes place slowly. In 2013, this Ixil village in Guatemala got its first laundromat. Yet, looking closely, we see there are no washing machines or dryers. Isolated in the jungle of eastern Mexico, these Lacandon villagers are turning to modern construction for their housing and are even connecting to the internet. Their children may one day have no need of the village library. It is by education, though, that the Maya are moving into the modern world in ways that will benefit them the most. Maya communities are now getting access to the education system of their post-colonial country. This Yucatec school in Belize has a computer lab, and this Tzeltal school in Mexico has a chemistry lab. In Honduras, these Chorti children learn about Earth Day and climate change. Quechua children in Guatemala learn music. What will become of the Maya? If a people who thrived for so long now face threats to their survival, what chance is there for the rest of us? In modern times, the Maya of Guatemala have endured genocide more intentional than that of European colonization. Today they go to the polls, and one of their own was recently a presidential candidate. Their cousins in Mexico have resisted post-colonial oppression and are teaching the world what democracy looks like. In Honduras and Belize, the Maya are also beginning to have their voices heard on local and international stages. Perhaps we'd better ask, what will become of us all? The fate and the future of the Maya are our fate and our future. We will adapt and survive, or we will repeat the fate of so many species before us, extinction.